Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're delighted to have with us this evening Benjamin Nathans, who's here to discuss his new book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. Ben's an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches and writes about Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and the history of human rights. He's the author previously of Beyond the Pale, about the Jewish experience in late Imperial Russia. His new book, if you haven't seen it yet, it's pretty lengthy and thick, and justifiably so, because it tells quite an important story, very comprehensively and quite authoritatively. It's the story of dissent in the Soviet Union, starting in the 1960s through the Soviet Union's collapse. The movement that began then captured the world's imagination and was the first movement for civil and human rights in the socialist world. It consisted of a rather improbable array of individuals who came together to demand, essentially, that the Kremlin obey its own laws. They held unauthorized public gatherings, petitioned in support of arrested intellectuals, and circulated uncensored typewritten texts. A few dissidents gained worldwide fame, and you'll, I'm sure, recognize their names. People like Nobel laureates Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But those individuals weren't the movement's driving forces, actually. A number of others were, and many of those involved remain virtually unknown today. The dissidents were subjected to exile, bogus trials, vicious press campaigns, and sentences in psychiatric hospitals and labor camps. And they were all but crushed by the early 1980s. Some emerged again later that same decade during the heady days of Mikhail Gorbachev. But as Ben writes, the dream of a less authoritarian post-Soviet Russia has long since evaporated. Putin has liquidated the last surviving institutional traces of the dissident movement, and most of those who were involved in it have been forgotten. Ben's aim for the book, he says, is to highlight their history. Indeed, at a time when authoritarianism is again on the rise around the world, this extensive study of why certain individuals became dissidents in the Soviet Union, how they emerged from totalitarianism and formed a movement, offers relevant lessons for how citizens of contemporary dictatorial societies can conceive and act on options for political engagement. In conversation with Ben will be Andrew Weiss, another expert on Russia. He's currently the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Before that, Andrew directed the RAND Corporation Center for Russia and Eurasia, and during the Clinton and George H.W. Bush administrations, he served on the NSC staff, the State Department's policy planning staff, and the Pentagon's policy office. A couple of years ago, he published a graphic novel, Accidental Tsar, The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ben Nathans and Andrew Weiss.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Weiss. It's a real privilege to be here with Benjamin Nathans, and thank you for that great introduction, Bradley. I will get us started with a few questions, and then I very much will try to bring everyone else who's here into the conversation. And my hope is that we can really capture some of the issues that Bradley Graham was just talking about how improbable the dissident movement was in its rise and its incredible impact. But I should say that Ben is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, and over the last several years, his author bio specified that this book was coming, and I was waiting with bated breath for the book. And it is well worth the wait. It is a definitive and very compelling history. It is a very colorful history. It has a lot of classic Soviet ironic humor laced through, which I'm sure reflects the author's own hand as well. But I want to start by connecting some of the present day factors that we just heard about to the heyday of the Soviet dissident movement. And I know it's dangerous to rely on stereotypes or false comparisons, but I was very struck by something that David Herzenhorn of the Washington Post said about Alexei Navalny's reaction to the title of his biography, The Dissident, and how Navalny was actually bristling at the use of that term with regard to himself. And Herzenhorn said at an event, quote, Navalny thought Soviet dissidents took an easy path. They never won anything. There was a lot of respect among Navalny and his team for those dissidents, but they thought of them literally as losers, as not having brought down the Soviet Union, as not having won any kind of power or office. Navalny never wanted to be seen that way. So I'm just curious, is that an unfair or unreasonable verdict on what the Soviet dissidents accomplished? You, in the beginning of the book, talk about a poll which says that 1 in 5 Russians about 10 years ago, only 1 in 5 could even name a single dissident figure. And there are very few pictures. Your book kind of has, I think, almost all of the pictures that exist of the dissident movement, but there's no, flashy photo of someone like Martin Luther King at the reflecting pool. These are people who worked in small, often clandestine ways in a very decentralized fashion. So I'm just sort of curious, do you think the current generation of rights activists are missing something about what people did and died for in the Soviet era?
Thank you, Andrew. First, let me just start by thanking Politics and Prose and the whole team here for organizing this event. It's wonderful to be here and to have a fantastic audience with a lot of familiar faces going way, way back in my life. Wonderful to have you here. So you asked about that passage in Herzenhorn's biography of Navalny, and for those of you who haven't seen the book, it's called The Dissident. So it's not just that somewhere inside he makes this analogy of Navalny and company to the Soviet dissidents. The title of the book itself sort of inscribes that analogy. And my antenna obviously went up when I saw that because I have my own doubts about how appropriate it is. But my doubts are different from Navalny's. So Navalny wanted to, he was killed, of course, in a Russian prison in February of this year. He wanted to distance himself from the history that I tell in this book because, as you quoted him saying, he thought they failed to achieve their objectives. They lost the battle that they themselves undertook in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. I think he made a category mistake in saying that because dissidents did not set out to topple the Soviet government. Like most Soviet citizens, they thought that that government, or at least that country, was a forever country. They had no ability to imagine that it might crumble like a house of cards, let alone in their own lifetimes. There were maybe 1 or 2 exceptions among the dissident community in the Soviet Union who could imagine the Soviet regime falling apart, but that was not their goal. They also did not have the goal of themselves coming to power someday. They never aspired to control the state. And the icing on the cake is that they actually didn't see themselves as political activists. It's hard to believe, but Soviet dissidents who to a Western audience appeared to be some of the most politically engaged citizens of that country insisted that what they were doing was apolitical. That when you advocate the rule of law or the rule of human rights, you are not engaging in political activity. To my mind, it was an unsustainable position, but the circumstances in which they operated required them to at least pay lip service to the idea that they were not political activists. So they had a different agenda and they had a different vocabulary from Navalny. And I'm a little surprised that he didn't realize that, because at least during the last years of his life, when he was in jail after returning from his near-death experience, having been poisoned by the FSB, the successor to the KGB, he spent a lot of time in prison before he was eventually killed. And one of the things that we know he was doing in prison was reading the memoirs of Soviet dissidents. Solzhenitsyn, Anatoly Marchenko, Natan Sharansky. He even corresponded with Sharansky. There were several exchanges of letters from his prison in Omsk to Jerusalem. So it surprises me a little bit that he misread the dissident agenda, but it's understandable given that Navalny himself was a politician, did want to be elected to public office.
It's really interesting. Part of what struck me about the book were these characters that you bring to life, many of whom have not been front and center in the public eye, like Solzhenitsyn or Sharansky or Sakharov. And the one person who seems to be the big hero of the book is an eccentric mathematician named Alexander Volpin. And you describe him as Don Quixote in the land of the Soviets, and as an eccentric mathematician known to walk the streets of Moscow in his house slippers. Can you walk us through who Volpin was and why you dedicate so much of the book to telling his story?
Sure. First, I should say that in the process of researching and writing this book, the feeling that I had most consistently was, I just hope I can do justice to this material and these people. Because as you can imagine, the selection process, or the self-selection process for becoming a dissident in the Soviet Union, guaranteed that these were highly unusual people, extraordinary people, very well educated in many cases, lots of people from the STEM fields, but also lots of writers, people from the humanities, also people outside of the intelligentsia, although they tended to predominate. So the cast of characters in this story is literally like from a Russian novel. That's how engaging they were to me. And I felt my responsibility as a historian and a writer was just to do justice to the depth of their experience and their life stories. Volpin, his full name is Alexander Sergeyevich Yesenin Volpin. He was the extramarital son of a brief affair between a man who at the time was arguably, and there are Russians in the audience who can either correct me or corroborate me, the most famous poet, Sergei Yesenin, fantastically popular in the 1920s and 30s, quoted all the time. People knew his poetry by heart. So he had an affair with a translator named Nadezhda Volpina. And their son, Alexander, was born in 1924. And he was a prodigy in many respects. Eventually went on to get a PhD in mathematical logic from Moscow State University, the preeminent institution of higher education in the Soviet Union. And I don't want to go into all the detail, but the reason why he's so prominent is that he's the intellectual godfather of the dissident grand strategy. And that grand strategy was disarmingly simple. And it was basically just try to make the Soviet Union live up to its own laws. There was a constitution ratified on December 5th, 1936. Can you all hear me in the back, by the way? Yep. December 5th, 1936, the so-called Stalin Constitution. And against all of your intuition, it actually contained fantastic civil liberties. It enshrined freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. It's true that it circumscribed all of those things. They all had to advance the cause of the working class and of the building of socialism. Nonetheless, the language of civil liberties was inscribed in the Soviet Constitution. And Volpin, having gotten his PhD in mathematical logic, was someone who was interested not just in mathematics, but in the nature of truth statements per se. He was interested in what constituted truth and how could truth be proven with the clarity and the rigor that only mathematics can generate. In the 1940s and 1950s, Volpin was exposed to a number of let's call them international cross currents. He started reading Wittgenstein, who was translated into Russian. He started reading the work of an MIT professor named Norbert Wiener, who was the father of cybernetics. Long story short, Volpin joined the cohort of intellectuals across the Western world whose goal in life was to create a language of perfect transparency, a language of communication which would contain none of the ambiguities of human languages. It would have the clarity and the precision of mathematics itself. This was the Holy Grail. Wittgenstein was involved in this, the early Wittgenstein, Norbert Wiener, many people at Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard. It was really a kind of global quest. Didn't work out, needless to say. But Volpin had a plan B when he discovered, after he was arrested and had to come face to face with the Soviet judicial system, he discovered that in the Soviet Constitution and in the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure, there was something approximating a language with very clear injunctions. You may do this, you may not do that. You must do this. A clear set of behavioral instructions. And he thought, maybe I can deploy Soviet law to at least approximate a language of perfect clarity, but also a language which could be used to place limits on the behavior of the Soviet state. So in the book, I try to make the case that without him ever having, as far as I know, read anything by George F. Kennan, without him knowing what the American Cold War policy of containment was all about, Volpin comes up with his own version of domestic containment and the way he's going to contain the behavior of the Stalinist state, which is notorious for its lethal arbitrariness, is to pressure the state to live up to its own laws. And that becomes the grand strategy of the dissident movement.
So part of the luck of the dissident movement was that it came to the fore during the vegetarian phase, as a Russian memoirist put it, of the Soviet system, and people were not being slaughtered en masse or thrown in labor camps or starved to death or any of the other horrible excesses of the Soviet era. And I'm just curious, if you think of the effort to force the Soviet Union to actually focus on their laws, take them at face value, a government that's that is fully capable of killing everyone who resists or stands up against the Soviet leadership's goals for their strengthening their rule. It's striking to me that what I don't fully understand, you can explain this to me, is they didn't want a movement, and they actually very deliberately didn't want leaders, they didn't want membership organizations for the most part, and they were willing to tolerate all sorts of other agendas and not feel they had to control them. It was a very amorphous structure at the same time. So it sort of was counter to what anyone who would have grown up in a Marxist-Leninist model presumably would have thought about, where revolutions and change are brought about by small groups that work clandestinely like the dissidents did. So can you sort of square that circle?
Sure. So I wouldn't quite say that they didn't want a movement. I'd say there was about a 3-year period in the mid-60s, between 65 and 68, when they were trying to amass large numbers of activists. But what they really balked at and struggled with was their determination, or they balked at the idea of having known leaders and hierarchies within the movement, any kind of formal division of labor. The way I explain this, and it took me a while to arrive at this, is that we're really only going to understand Soviet dissidents if we stop seeing them as little Western liberals who just, by accident of fate, were born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. We're only going to understand them if we take our leave of a very noxious American habit of projecting our own instincts and assumptions on every resistance movement in every other country. Soviet dissidents were Soviet people. It seems like a banal, obvious thing to say, but to really crack the code of this movement and understand its internal dynamics, I had to start seeing them as products of the Soviet system, which they all were. They were all born after the revolution. They were all educated in Soviet schools and Soviet universities. They were all employed by the Soviet state, just like everybody else, since there was only one employer in that system. So what they balked at was reproducing the Bolshevik model, and not just the Bolshevik model, the 19th century revolutionary model, made famous by all those great novels of the 19th century in Russian, the model of the underground conspiratorial group, which has a charismatic leader like Lenin, which has a pronounced set of roles that people have to occupy, very hierarchical. You have to take commands from above kind of unthinkingly and carry out your mission. There was a certain romanticism associated with revolutionary conspiracy, but the dissidents belonged to a generation that had basically had it with the revolution and its legacy. They thought the last thing they wanted for Russia and the other peoples of the Soviet Union was another revolution. In a way, their approach to collective action is very similar in some ways to the 60s in this country and in France and in Germany and Italy. This anti-hierarchical approach to collective action, no set rules, no set membership, no hierarchies. The idea was that people ideally should obey the dictates of their own conscience. Now, for a movement dedicated to the rule of law, obeying your conscience is kind of a problem because conscience and law don't always align with each other. And I was frustrated at the lack of wrestling with that basic problem, just like I was frustrated when Volpin described himself to a visiting British student at the World Youth Festival in 1957 as an anarchist. And I thought, how can you be an anarchist and also a proponent of the rule of law, trying to get your government to contain its own behavior by obeying its own laws? I had the good fortune of meeting Alexander Volpin, both in this country where he was based after he left the Soviet Union and back in Russia where he eventually returned for long visits. And I had this contradiction in mind, and I asked him, I said, well, why did you think you were an anarchist at the same time you were advocating the rule of law? And he was very eccentric. He really was kind of a Don Quixote figure. And he turned to me and said, if I had known about the concept of libertarian, that's what I would have said. But he didn't. So again, he used the vocabulary available to him, and that was a Soviet vocabulary. So he described himself as an anarchist.
You raised the way we in the West perceive the dissident movement, and you sort of had a bit of a heavily freighted phrasing, which I can't recreate. And I just wanted to sort of pin you down on how you actually view the role of the West, because clearly there are people in this room I know who are friends of Peter Reddaway, who was a great colleague for many of us, who recently passed away, and he did a lot with others to bring manuscripts and other important documents out of the Soviet Union and publish them. And then also there were mechanisms for bringing them back into the Soviet system to smuggle them in through the system of samizdat and other sort of word-of-mouth activities. The CIA, the American-sponsored Radio Liberty and Voice of America, Western governments, prominent Western intellectuals, the media, all played a role in creating awareness of the dissident movement and also putting pressure on the Soviet authorities and sort of holding a spotlight on these people and their treatment as a way of making the Soviets kind of squirm in the hot seat. But do you think they were mainly cheerleaders in this whole drama in the West, or were they accelerants at a process that without Western involvement would have sort of metastasized and gotten the kind of traction it did?
You can't tell the story without the Western presence, the Western gaze, Western journalists, and above all, the Western shortwave radio programs. You probably know their names: the BBC, the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, the Deutsche Welle, Kol Israel, on and on and on. Let me try to explain why the story can't be told without the West. So this is going to be a very short detour. The American civil rights movement unfolds roughly at the same time as the Soviet civil rights movement, which is what the dissident movement was originally. The lesser known side of the American civil rights movement is that it actually started as a human rights movement, largely by black veterans returning from the Second World War. And the momentum behind the United Nations and the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was an international consensus about human rights as requiring nothing more than being human. You didn't have to be a citizen of any given state. Human rights were for the species as a whole. The human rights approach to the black predicament in this country quickly gave way during the Cold War under the pressure of McCarthyism to a much more American story, the American civil religion of equal opportunity. And the story of that movement is of what begins as a human rights movement becoming a civil rights movement that appeals not to international norms, but to American law, specifically American federal law, as a form of leverage against the legal segregation that was the bedrock of Jim Crow in the South. The Soviet dissident story is exactly the opposite. It starts out as a civil rights movement appealing to the Soviet Constitution, and it's only after it fails to gain traction with that body of law that it turns outward to the corpus of international human rights norms. So the international setting, and specifically the Western role, was crucial, not just in providing the norms to which the Soviet dissidents appealed, but Western journalists were the ones who got their story out to the rest of the world. The dissident appeal failed to get any kind of attention from the Soviet government. Hundreds of letters and petitions, never received, as far as I have been able to tell, never received a single written answer. The only response to dissident petitions and demonstrations was a behavioral response, arresting people, throwing them in psychiatric institutions, punishing their family members in various ways, firing them from their jobs, making sure their kids didn't get into any universities. Never a written response, never any kind of formal engagement with Volpin's philosophy of the rule of law. The contrast could not have been greater. In the West, they became the darlings, not just of the media, but of lots and lots of ordinary people. Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov, Sharansky, these were household names at one point in the 1970s. Everybody knew those names. Two of them got Nobel Prizes. Sharansky, after 9 years in prison, was eventually allowed to travel to Israel, be reunited with his wife. Also, front page news the whole time. The other element of Western influence was these shortwave radio stations, which often were able to get copies of the so-called samizdat text, the self-published text made with onion skin paper, carbon paper, typewriters, distributed like a chain letter. They were often smuggled out by journalists or diplomats who had privileges at the embassy or the consulate, and they made their way to the BBC or the Voice of America, and they were broadcast back in what we would now call audiobooks. The actual number of dissidents, if we define them as people who ever signed an open petition with their names right there in the open for everyone to see, maybe 1,000. Drop in the ocean in the context of a Soviet population of about 240 million. The number of people who heard those texts broadcast on the shortwave radio system, probably 10 million. Very, very popular pastime, especially among retirees in the Soviet Union, was to listen to the BBC in the evening over tea. We have massive anecdotal evidence of this, even if there were no, Nielsen ratings for the shortwave broadcast services. So you can't tell the story without the Western boomerang mechanism. But I have to say the influence of the West goes way beyond that, because as any journalist knows, there's an ocean of material that is eligible for tomorrow's headlines. And it's the Washington Post and the New York Times that decides which tiny fraction of the eligible raw material is deemed newsworthy. So a process of selection happened. And Western journalists, who almost without exception were male, this was Hedrick Smith, this was Anatole Shub. Those of you who have some miles on your odometer know these names. They were very prominent because they were the Moscow correspondents. They saw, in some cases, what they were primed to see, and they didn't see what they weren't primed to see. They thought that a movement like this would naturally have leaders. And so, in a sense, they created those leaders. They had a Western conception of what an underground movement in the Soviet setting should look like. They didn't understand the dissident allergy to hierarchy. And so they created celebrities in this movement, which is not to take anything away from the professional accomplishments of people like Solzhenitsyn, truly one of the great writers of the 20th century, or Sakharov, one of the great physicists, the designer of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. That's the least of his accomplishments as a scientist. But when you shine a very strong spotlight on a group of people, some people become extremely visible and others are left in the shadows. And it's the people in the shadows, as I discovered, who were actually the backbone of the movement. Solzhenitsyn was a solo operator. He wasn't interested in signing group petitions. Sakharov arrived at the movement relatively late and, for his own reasons, was very uncomfortable with the idea of being the moral leader of the movement. The Western journalists tended to miss the people who were the real engines of this movement over time, and what they really missed were the women. They never wrote as nearly as extensively about the women in this movement who are absolutely indispensable to its history. The most famous underground periodical of the dissident movement, the so-called Chronicle of Current Events, founded in 1968, managed to publish on an almost monthly basis until 1982, was founded by a poet named Natalia Gorbanevskaya, who nobody's heard of. And I could multiply that example many times over. So the journalists were indispensable to getting the dissident message, but they also missed a lot along the way.
So I just want to pin you down on this. You didn't talk at all about Western governments and the role of high-level pressure and political pressure. And then there were these dueling motivations at the time with the so-called détente that emerged between the United States and the Soviet Union that allowed them to cooperate in certain ways or put in the rearview mirror certain things like recognition of the Soviet borders. I'm just sort of curious, it's not a really central part of the book. You don't delve into that. And I can remember being in Politics and Prose talking to Paul Goldberg about this quote from Henry Kissinger, where Kissinger is talking to Nixon privately and says, they could be putting these people in ovens and it wouldn't matter all that much to me. Like, it's not central to US foreign policy. So I'm just sort of curious if that was a deliberate choice on your part, that you didn't think that policymakers mattered in how the movement unfolded.
All right, I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is being filmed, so I may live to regret this, but I think that's an apocryphal quotation from Henry Kissinger. What Kissinger actually said was, I don't understand why the Soviet government, and Brezhnev in particular, is getting so bent out of shape about these dissidents. You know, you could put their samizdat writings for sale on a kiosk in Moscow and it wouldn't change a thing. So what it's true that Kissinger, being a kind of instrumental, very hard-nosed realist in international relations, didn't think that the US government should be getting involved in any domestic issues in the Soviet Union whatsoever. That is true. And the dissidents very much did not appreciate that. They didn't like that attitude. But Kissinger's other feeling about the dissidents was that they were powerless and that the Soviet government, for reasons he couldn't quite understand, was vastly overreacting to every little statement by this or that dissident. The question is still open, though. Was he right about that? Could the dissidents have been allowed to circulate their ideas freely and openly without changing the system? So I was and I am interested in what the US government and particularly the intelligence services knew and when they knew it and what their take was on this movement in real time. And I did do some research on that. I got materials from the Johnson Presidential Library and the Nixon Library and selection of CIA documents. And the book is not short. I'll admit it. And I didn't want to make it any longer than it already is, so I didn't include that. I may write an article about it someday. But basically what I found was the CIA and the NSA and the State Department, NSC, and the State Department, while they wanted to use dissidents as a thorn in the side of the opponent, had a very sober estimation of what the dissidents could accomplish, and that estimation was pretty low. They were pessimists, in other words. They didn't believe that they should invest significantly in dissidents. They were also highly attuned to the damage that could be done to the dissidents if any kind of connection to the CIA were ever discovered. And of course, the KGB was constantly asserting that everybody from Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov on down were just marionettes of Western intelligence services, even though I looked long and hard for evidence of that, didn't find it. So you're absolutely right to put your finger on that issue. It's something I didn't get to in the book, in part because there was no smoking gun.
So I'm conscious of our time. Let me ask you a couple last questions before turning things over to folks who are with us tonight. Let's talk about Sakharov for a minute. This was a person who was literally the pride of the leadership of his country and had access to all the perks and privileges of the Soviet elite. And there's a very memorable passage in the book when you say, quote, "When Sakharov requested leniency for arrested writers or people involved in the samizdat publications, he did so by calling KGB Director Andropov on the high-frequency telephone in his office at a top-secret nuclear installation, or by sending a private note to Brezhnev." So you don't get more insidery than that. And I just am curious if you can briefly sort of sketch the arc of how Sakharov became disenchanted and then the bravery that was involved in speaking out the way he did.
Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov was a truly extraordinary individual. By any estimate, his professional accomplishments as a physicist, his moral authority as a dissident, his engagement on behalf of individuals who he considered to be suffering unjustly. Sakharov was another child prodigy like Alexander Volpin. He studied theoretical physics at Moscow State University, and his talent was recognized at a very early age, and he was essentially drafted into the Soviet nuclear weapons research program. By the time he was in his 30s, he had been made a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, which was a huge deal. That's the elite of that highly scientifically literate society. And as I mentioned earlier, he was, more than anyone else, the architect of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. So he was part of this team of elite, very, very talented, world-class physicists who quickly allowed the Soviet Union to more or less match the United States in its atomic and nuclear arsenal. Some observers, both inside the KGB and outside the Soviet Union, have been seduced by the idea that Sakharov was a kind of Soviet Robert Oppenheimer, that he was racked by guilt at a certain point over the weapon of mass destruction that he had put in the hands of Joseph Stalin. This all happened under Stalin's watch, at least the atomic bomb did. And that his path to descent from this loftiest of positions in Soviet society, he had every privilege and honor you could imagine, from a private driver to this high-frequency telephone and a very, very nice dacha for him and his family. He was considered so valuable the Soviet Union didn't allow him to fly on airplanes. Private train car was the way he traveled from Moscow to his top-secret weapons research facility. So this assumption that he was the Soviet Oppenheimer positioned Sakharov as racked by guilt over the weapons that he placed in Stalin's hands and the hands of Stalin's successors. Totally wrong. To the end of his life, Sakharov maintained that giving the Soviet Union nuclear weapons was a critical step towards peace because it created the balance of mutual assured destruction. that the most dangerous thing you could have was when one country, had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. So he was not racked by guilt. He was, however, disturbed at the loss of control over the weapon once he had successfully tested it. And there's a famous scene, which I recount in the book, of Sakharov being the guest of honor at a banquet celebrating the first successful test of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. This is in, I think, 1955 or 6. I forget the exact date. And Sakharov, who has led a rather closeted existence, sort of the rarefied world of theoretical physics in Moscow and elsewhere, he gives the honorary first toast. And those of you who know Russia a little bit or know Russians know that giving a good toast is serious business in that culture. It's a very highly developed art form, and the title of my book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, is a toast that the dissidents would make among themselves. So Sakharov raises his glass, and he says in so many words, may our new nuclear weapons always succeed in their tests and never be used over real cities and real people. And there was a stony silence in the room because the military elite thought this was utterly transgressive. Sakharov was a scientist, not a politician, and therefore he had no right to say anything in public about the use of those weapons. They assumed that he had no understanding of the way weapons can be used as a threat without actually being detonated, or that you might actually someday need to detonate a nuclear weapon in a war of attrition against the United States. So he did have certain misgivings about what he had enabled, but he was not the Soviet Oppenheimer. What caused the transformation in him had much more to do with a quality that I deeply admire in Soviet and Russian intellectuals, which is their contempt for disciplinary boundaries. What really rattled Sakharov was when he started to do research that technically should have been the province of biologists and of people in the field of human medicine. He started doing research about radioactive fallout. What actually happens to all those billions of particles that are released when you test an atomic weapon above ground, which was the technique du jour up until the early 1960s. And the more he looked into it, the more he realized that the dozens and then hundreds of nuclear tests that the superpowers were conducting, didn't matter whether they were in Central Asia or Tahiti or Nevada or wherever, were spewing terrible amounts of radioactive waste into the atmosphere. And he actually performed his own calculations about the rise in the incidence of cancer that was likely to happen 30, 40, 50 years down the road. He took those concerns first to the Academy of Sciences and then to the Soviet leadership. He had that phone. He could talk to Andropov or Khrushchev or Brezhnev pretty much any time he wanted, until he fell out of favor, of course. And there again, he got the message, you're a physicist, you design the weapons, we'll worry about the fallout and the human implications of above ground testing. So it was a very gradual process of realizing that the government was in the hands of people who did not really share his moral concerns, not about the use of atomic weapons even, but even about their testing. And when he saw intellectuals being arrested, he started getting engaged on their behalf.
That's fascinating, Ben. Last question from me. We've been talking about some really, really noble and good people and brave people, but we haven't really talked about the really, really bad people as much. So I want to make sure we give Vladimir Putin and his ilk a little bit of airtime here, specifically the 5th Directorate of the KGB. And the book, in its arc, culminates in a very dense section, and I mean this in the best sense, about the ways the 5th Directorate under Andropov as KGB director set about to destroy the dissident movement. And without giving away the punchline of the book, it worked. And although they shied away for the most part from assassination, they threw everything they had at this rather small target. And it was devious and pretty effective. And I'm just curious, as you look at what the KGB did to the dissidents. I'm just curious, one, why did they wait so long? Like, why didn't they nip this in the bud earlier in the 60s when it was less of a big problem for the system? And two, if they succeed, there's this incredible irony, which I just love your thoughts on. They largely squelched the dissident movement before perestroika and before Gorbachev comes to power, but then he embraces a lot of the slogans and the ideas of the dissidents. And I'm just curious about the dissonance and the tension that that obviously unleashed, and we're dealing with some of the consequences, obviously, with Putin's revanche.
Yeah. Okay, so people who write the histories of intelligence services, you know, it's not a story of angels. So I'm certainly not here to defend the KGB, but the truth is that in the post-Stalin era, the KGB was trying to reformat itself as a highly professional organization, taking its leave of the kind of dungeon tactics that Stalin had brought to a frenzy in the 1930s. The crucial difference is that the 1930s and early 40s were a period in which nobody in the Soviet Union was safe. The application of state-sponsored violence qualifies, I think, as terrorism precisely because it was random. Right? That's the essence of terrorism, is to instill the maximum fear in the maximum number of people by targeting anybody, by making it random. That's how terrorism works. The KGB after Stalin, for the most part, only went after people who had done something that they construed as being troublemaking or illegal. I'm not saying they got that right all the time, but they were not about the random application of violence. And that's the opening that made the dissident movement possible. And one of the saddest things about this story is that, as I said at the beginning, dissidents did not aspire to capture the state. They did not aspire to topple the Soviet state. They wanted to reform the Soviet state and make it a law-abiding enterprise. The KGB didn't know how to react to that agenda. They had a lot of experience with monarchists. They had a lot of experience with people who thought the revolution had jumped the tracks and described themselves as true Leninists and mimics the underground conspiratorial patterns of the Bolshevik Party. They had lots of experience with nationalists from Ukraine and the Baltic states and elsewhere. What they had never encountered before the 1960s was people who described themselves as constitutionalists, where the Constitution was the Soviet Constitution. So they literally didn't know how to react. They thought they could use the Soviet legal system to asphyxiate the movement. And to be sure, every time, almost without any exceptions, every time they put a dissident on trial, they got their guilty verdict. Why? Because the verdict was decided before the trial. You know, somebody picked up the telephone to the judge and said, you're going to give them this many number of years and they're going to go to this camp or this prison. The problem was the guilty verdict rarely translated into the kind of political dividends that you want from a trial. They turned the dissidents into martyrs, and they made themselves look terrible because they were prosecuting people for writing, for example, works of fiction, or for writing things that were praising the civil liberties enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. So they didn't know how to react to this new agenda. And the sad part of the story is that the impact of the dissident campaign for the rule of law was actually to push the KGB further and further into extrajudicial techniques. Trials were not delivering the dividends they wanted. So what do? They punish people indirectly by firing them, by kicking them out of their apartments, and in the worst case scenario, avoiding any possibility of a trial by declaring them mentally ill and placing them in psychiatric institutions where there was no limit on the length of the sentence. And where, by the way, some of the dissidents were subject to antipsychotic drugs, which essentially disabled their ability to read and write and think. That was the Soviet version of psychological warfare. Not the battle of ideas, but the battle against ideas and thinking itself. So by the 1970s, the KGB had embarked in an enormous campaign affecting hundreds of thousands of people who the KGB thought might be on the cusp of engaging in dissident activities, all of which was extrajudicial. This is the KGB in which Putin came of age. And even though he likes to limit his description of his service in that intelligence organization to his time in Dresden, in East Germany, we now know beyond the shadow of a doubt, because his name features on several interrogation records and apartment searches, that he was in fact working in what was called the Fifth Directorate, which was the subunit within the KGB responsible for combating the dissident movement. Many of the techniques that they developed then are alive and well now. In fact, they've been enhanced. So of those 1,000 people I mentioned who were the inner core of the movement, the people who actually signed their names to petitions and open letters, I would estimate that roughly half, 500, were forced to emigrate. And when I say forced to emigrate, I mean they were called into the KGB and told, would you like to go to prison for 10 years or would you like to leave the country next week? And quite a few of them had had enough at that time and they chose to leave. Putin has taken that technique much, much further. Roughly 1 million people have fled Russia since the invasion of February, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, February 2022. Some of them are in the audience tonight. That is a technique for getting the country rid of its most independent thinkers.
Thank you, Ben. Well, let me turn to folks who have questions. There's a microphone up here, a couple of ground rules. If you could introduce yourself, and if you could also make sure that your question ends with a question mark, that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. That was terrific. I was here in Washington working in the 1970s, so I remember all this very, very well. My question is, I forget what the name of the law is, something Medvinsky. Jews were trying to get out, and the Soviets wouldn't let them. Were dissidents also trying to leave, or were some of them trying to leave, or was there any connection besides Sharansky between the Jews who were trying to emigrate and weren't being allowed to and these people?
Thank you. Very important question. On a popular level, there's often a confusion between dissidents and refuseniks, as if they kind of were part of the same groups. As you said, refuseniks were Jews who had been denied permission to leave, and whether or not you were denied or you weren't denied, your agenda was to exit the country, not to reform it. And that was the cardinal difference between refuseniks and dissidents. Dissidents were people who wanted to live in a better version of the Soviet Union and wanted to change the way the system functioned. The complicating factor is that a very significant proportion of dissidents were of Jewish origin, possibly up to half. That's in a country where 1% to 3% of the population was ethnically Jewish, as defined. Sharansky is an example. Sharansky is an unusual person, though. He was kind of amphibious. He could move backwards and forwards between the two currents very easily. Most people didn't want to do that. Most refuseniks didn't want to have anything to do with the dissidents because that would indirectly entangle them in domestic Soviet political controversies, like how the Constitution is or is not observed. So while many dissidents, including Sakharov, were absolutely convinced that the right to leave one's own country was a fundamental human right, and that therefore the dissident movement should be supporting the refuseniks and other ethnic groups who might want to leave, ethnic Germans, for example, or Armenians, or evangelical Christians, all of whom wanted to leave the Soviet Union. For a lot of other dissidents, it was very controversial, and they wanted to maintain that firewall between people who want to stay and reform the system and people who simply are looking for an exit ramp.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kieran Connolly. I'm local. And so my question is, so within the more mainstream Soviet Union, there were a lot of people who were systematic people, like the poet Yevgeny Evtushenko and others who were not dissidents, but they would, and especially in the 60s, would say things that were a little critical of the way things were, or even of the government. How do you see the kind of more systematic people who flirted with with dissident topics as sort of fitting into the wider picture?
For those of you who don't know him or haven't read him, Yevgeny Yevtushenko was a very prominent Russian poet, really kind of a rock star in his day. He was also very tall and very good looking. He eventually moved to this country, I think, after the Soviet Union collapsed. But in the 60s and 70s, he was one of those writers, or I should say poets, who had almost a kind of sixth sense of where the boundaries of the permissible lay. And he pushed those boundaries over and over again, but was very careful not to cross them. This being Russia, the Soviet Union, there was a lot of bad blood between people like Yevtushenko and the people that I would describe as actual dissidents. They were resentful of the way that he always knew how to trim the sails and not to get arrested. And he, of course, himself was very sensitive to this question of whether he was, in some ways, more loyal to the regime than to his art, because he was always towing the line at the right point. To give you an example of the toxicity of this divide, when I was a graduate student in Berkeley, I once went to a poetry reading by Joseph Brodsky, who had been forced out of the Soviet Union in 1972 after having done several years of internal exile, being put on trial. And I don't know how the name Yevtushenko came up, but it did at this reading. And Brodsky said, "Oh, Yevtushenko, the guy is a prostitute." And then he corrected himself. He said, "Sorry, there's nothing wrong with prostitution. Yevtushenko was a political prostitute, and that's the worst kind of all." So there were lots of people on the margins of the movement who were careful not to get involved too deeply, and he was one of them. Which, I'm not saying anything about the quality of his poetry, but his political activism was of that character.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lila. Thank you so much. This has been very interesting. I'm unfamiliar with this topic, but I just thought it was interesting, so I came. But you mentioned briefly the other countries that were a part of the Soviet Union, and I'm curious, the Soviet dissidents, what was their perspective on independence for these other nations?
Terrific, yeah. So it's just from a terminology point of view, they weren't other countries, but they were non-Russian republics, like the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, all of the stands, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. Yes, so the Soviet Union was a multinational state. Some people would call it an empire. And the dissidents at various points were confronted with the need to take a position on the rights of non-Russian minorities, including national dissident movements in those non-Russian republics. Or for that matter, the Russian nationalist movement, which was also had a troubling relationship with the Soviet state. So in general, Soviet dissidents were starved for allies in their own country. They had plenty of fans in the West, for obvious reasons having to do with the Cold War, not so much inside the Soviet Union. Many times they felt utterly isolated and ghettoized in their own country. So they were eager to build alliances with people who were campaigning for autonomy, or in some cases even independence, in a place like Lithuania or Ukraine. But those relationships proved to be very dicey, because if you look at the writings and the memoirs of the non-Russian figures, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, and others, they never lost the suspicion that scratch a Soviet dissident and what you really find is a Russian who, consciously or not, reproduces all of the hierarchical assumptions about the Russian people being first among equals, about the Russian language being the lingua franca of the empire, which just on a pragmatic level it clearly was. But the tensions that we find today between the non-Russian former Soviet republics and the Russian Federation, you can already find inside relations among dissenters across those lines. And I never found really anything like a clear policy statement by the dissidents, with the possible exception of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in his usual emphatic, very clear-eyed way said, we should let all of the non-Slavic peoples go. The only logical union here is Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. At the time, that was a very brave and bold thing to say. Now, of course, no Ukrainian wants to hear that. No Ukrainian wants to hear about some kind of natural brotherhood between Ukrainians and Russians. But in the 1970s, in the Soviet setting, that was a bold position to take.
Thank you.
Well, Ben, I think we're going to leave it there. It has been a real privilege to be up here with you today to talk about
Likewise.
this amazing book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. It's a definitive and very entertaining read. I highly recommend it, and Ben will be signing books after we wrap up here tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for coming.
So copies of Ben's book are available at the checkout desk at the front of the store. He'll be up here behind this desk signing. Please form a line to the right of the desk, and our staff would appreciate it if you'd fold up your chairs. Thanks again for coming. Great talk.
Hey, I thought I spotted you. I was like, good to see you. Good to see you. Are you down here now? Me too.
Yeah. I'm down here for a little while. I'm at USA now.
Oh, great. I'm at Commerce, so we're just like right there in the same place. Yeah. What are you doing there?
I'm an inclusive education specialist in the
Yeah, I know. What a name.
disability and across the board.
Oh, amazing. Oh, that's so good.
I've been there for about 2 years. Been in the area for a little while. I was at Special Olympics before doing their.
I think I remember seeing that online or something.
It's not good for COVID. It's not comfortable. It looks nice. They have White House and all that. But spread it.
Okay, well,
People don't like to sit like this.
Okay, well.
And I did get I got sick of it. Because there are people who are actually in our problem. So, live for space. When you still get a rock star, they have to squeeze them all together. You gotta be, you gotta do the whole This isn't your first book, so you know the drill.
Yeah.
Yes, Phil and I were excited to be able to come tonight and